Hello and welcome to another video that is going to help you get the top grades. Today we're looking at a question on Jekyll and Hyde, and here it is. So we've got to write about how Stevenson presents Hyde's violence in the extract and obviously in the novel as a whole. And the extract that this student has been given is the one in which Sir Danvers Carew is killed. So it's easy for you to find that. I'll leave it there. I'm going to take you through the student's essay paragraph by paragraph, and after each paragraph I'll refer to the mark scheme and explain to you how that works to guide the examiner towards a mark. You'll also notice lots of little yellow corrections I've made, and I'm going to leave them and explain them at the end of the video if that's something that will interest you. So check it out and find out what you learn. Okay, we're going to start straight in with the thesis that this student has written. So he's been watching my videos on how to write a thesis, and I've artificially divided the paragraph up into 4 so that you can see there are 4 parts to his thesis. That's super ambitious. In the novella The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson presents the use of violence, so he's used the key word of the question, making sure that his answer is going to be relevant, as a dangerous and powerful desire that plagues humanity. Stevenson uses Hyde to show the dangers of falling into our desires to use violence. However, so this is now a different interpretation, Hyde is not inherently evil, and rather Jekyll suppressing Hyde, locking him up inside of his body, leads to Hyde becoming a savage and violent character. And this leads to Jekyll's fatal ending, as he cannot bear the guilt of the violence that Hyde will inflict on London. So all of these parts of the thesis are connected to violence, and there are 4 interpretations he's going to offer us in the essay. So automatically the examiner is thinking, okay, well this must be thoughtful and it's developed, at least as far as the thesis is concerned, so I start my marking here. I'm going to read the rest of the essay to see if it's convincing to go to the top, but that thesis has already controlled what I'm thinking as an examiner. I then come across to this bit here and I'm asking myself, is it thoughtful, detailed and developed? So that gives me a clue as to what developed means. It means detailed. Well, yes, so far I'm definitely being controlled by the writer and thinking it's definitely going to be there. We'll read the whole thing to see if it's well structured, but so far we're definitely on the right lines. And this band here, level 5, is where grade 7 is. Okay, grade 7 probably starts around 21 marks. The boundaries change every year, obviously, but grade 7 will be in this mark range. Stevenson clearly portrays the use of violence as an egregious desire that is frowned upon by Victorian society. However, Stevenson also reflects the pent-up violence that is embedded within society, shown in the character's desperation to use violence against Hyde. So now this is an original idea. We would expect most students to talk about how Hyde is violent, but no, because the question is about violence in the novel as a whole, he's very interestingly gone for the more sophisticated, because it's less obvious, interpretation that society is violent towards Hyde himself. Now this is clearly an instance where he's starting to explore ideas that other students don't have. That's what exploration looks like, thinking about different ways of looking at things. And he's done that straight away, and that's connected to the structure of his argument. He hasn't started with the obvious point, he's gone in with one that isn't obvious. It's not the first one that students would come up with. So already the examiner is thinking, oh well, perhaps I'm going to move up to the level 6 band. So let's see if he can prove this idea that society is violent towards Hyde. At the start of the novella, Hyde trampled calmly over a screaming child. This abhorrent use of violence portrays Hyde as an evil and quite psychotic character. The juxtaposition between trampled and calmly suggests Hyde's coolness and desensitized attitude towards the use of violence and his lack of consideration towards others. Well, this paragraph is now about how Hyde is violent. So Has the candidate lost control of their argument, or are they cleverly showing Hyde's violence before showing how society's violence is worse? Well, we'll have a look. However, the girl is described as not much the worse, more frightened than injured. This may suggest that Hyde's use of violence was merely accidental. Nevertheless, characters grow a strong hatred towards him, the doctor turning sick and white with the desire to kill him. This violent reaction towards a minor incident seems unjust considering the girl's healthy state. The word sick may refer to the disgust and loathing that the doctor had towards Hyde. Okay, let's make a new paragraph there actually so that I can just talk you through what we've seen so far. So this paragraph is showing how Hyde is violent. This one is showing that the doctor's reaction is much worse than Hyde's, because Hyde's appeared to be accidental and it hasn't caused the girl much harm, but the doctor very much wants to cause real harm to Hyde. So now I'm definitely seeing a well-structured argument contrasting Hyde's violence to that engendered in the society represented by the doctor. Right, now let's look at his style of writing, because in AO2 we've got to think about the writer's methods, and in AO1 we've got to think about precise references. So let's think about those two things, the precise references and the description of the methods. Well, the precise references are easy to spot. Those are the embedded quotations, short quotations that fit into your sentence. Every time you do that, the chances are your reference is precise. So your shorthand for that is, do my quotations fit into my sentences? If they do, I'm likely to be precise. Now let's have a look at the terminology. Okay, the terminology is in bold here. Terminology means the words that you need when you're writing about literature. So it's not about nouns, verbs, adjectives. It's where you're talking about the meaning. So novella, portrays, psychotic character, juxtaposition. These are all words you have to use when you're writing about a literature text. All right, not every character will be psychotic, but this kind of description of a character will always happen when you're writing about literary texts. The other thing that's almost terminology is the use of connectives, however and nevertheless. Oh, I haven't corrected the spelling of that. I'll do that now. However, I also want to point out the massive advantage of using words like however and nevertheless. So at the top of the mark scheme, we want convincing exploration of one or more ideas, perspectives, interpretations. If we come down to level 5, we want alternative interpretations again. Now, using this vocabulary, however, nevertheless, words like although, force you to think of a different interpretation. So just using the words will train you as a writer to think more deeply about the text and write better essays. And so my top advice is to steal these words and use them frequently in your paragraphs. You'll see that he starts the next paragraph as well with however. So he's constantly writing about alternative interpretations. And we know that is a level 5 skill where grade 7 lives. Well, let's go down to the one below and see if alternative interpretations is down here. Clear understanding of ideas, not alternative interpretations. Yes, so as soon as you start getting the alternative interpretations, you're definitely grade 7 writer. Okay, let's carry on. However, it may also suggest to his sick state of morality, as during the Victorian era, it was disapproved of to reveal your deep, dark desires of violence. Well, this is a paragraph that's getting no marks because this is true in every era. We've never been happy to reveal our deep desires for violence. But also, you haven't really proved that the doctor has revealed that desire. So to do that, you'd have to show that Enfield has worked it out. So you could do it, but you haven't shown that. So you've not really developed that argument. So let's carry on. Furthermore, there's another connective here which shows this is now a detailed point that builds on what went before. The Doctor's reaction is like the rest of them, lovely embedded quotation. It seems that Stevenson wants to highlight humanity's craving for violence, criticising Victorian judgmental attitudes towards the use of violence, as despite hating it, they cannot control themselves from using violence. So this is very slightly confused. So is the student arguing that Stevenson's really critical because society can't control its own violence? Or is he criticising society because it has a judgmental attitude towards violence? Now those are contradictory ideas, because if you're attacking society because it can't control its violence, then you are being judgmental, aren't you? So these are two contradictory ideas. You can't have both of them in the same sentence, because the reader is not sure which view you think is right. So we're stuck here, and you don't go on to tell us in this paragraph which view you think is right. Let's have a read of it. Hyde's use of violence is portrayed as wild and uncontrollable, yet this trait is deeply found within humanity. The extract is taken from chapter 4, the climax of the novella. Hyde is seen beating a member of Parliament to death with ape-like fury until his bones were audibly shattered. This highlights that absolute violence is embedded within Hyde. Referring to him as an ape intensifies the wild actions of Hyde while also galvanizing the reader. Okay, this is a beautifully written paragraph with the embedded quotations that we've talked about and lovely vocabulary. But what's missing is a discussion of why Stevenson has included this idea of wild and uncontrollable violence. So is he trying to criticize the Victorian judgment about violence, or is he trying to show that society can't control its use of violence, or is it only trying to show that this individual human being is incredibly violent and other people aren't like him? And we don't know. So you haven't linked it to the author's point of view here, and because we don't have the author's point of view, it's not getting the top marks in your structured argument. So we can clearly see that the paragraph is thoughtful and it's detailed and it's developed, but what we're missing is that well-structured argument where one point builds on another fluently to prove your point of view. Although it's got some deeper meanings in there, it doesn't now have lots of interpretations which are convincing, because you've sort of lost the thread of what you're trying to prove. Let's look at the next paragraph. Stevenson also alludes to Darwin's theory of evolution, which was prominent during the time that the novella was written. This theory was criticised widely by society as it directly contradicted the religious idea that humans were created in the image of God. This reference satisfies that violence was a desire that was commonly seen in apes and separate from humans, although it may also suggest that the idea that desire for violence is an inherent trait that we have kept from evolution. Okay, I'm now going to show you why that was an examination of context rather than a convincing exploration of context. Okay, if you're going to convincingly examine and explore, then you really need to come up with ideas why Stevenson is alluding to that theory. Yes, he's alluding to it because it's something that his audience are already thinking about, but how does he want to control and affect and change that thinking? And that's where the marks are moving up to the top of the band. So is he trying to show that their fears are irrational, or is he trying to stoke those fears to engender a sense of panic so more people will be deeply affected by his novel? Or a more sophisticated interpretation, is he trying to do both? On the one hand, heighten their fears, and on the other hand, gently mock and ridicule them as being unrealistic, because he himself was an atheist and therefore couldn't care less about the contradiction with Christianity because he's already rejected it. This esoteric idea is most likely understood by the sophisticated and modern reader who accepted the theory of evolution. Perhaps Stevenson does this to raise the question about whether humans are born with the desire to use violence. Stevenson also highlights the consequences of suppressing your primitive desire to use violence despite the enjoyment and satisfaction gained from its freedom. Now that's a brilliant idea, and you've raised it as a brilliant question whether humans are born with a desire to use violence, and you seem to be suggesting that yes, humans are born to use violence, but that suppressing it will make it worse, so that we must deal with our violence in some other way. But you're only hinting at that, and you're not saying what way we should deal with it, according to Stevenson. So this isn't fully exploratory. Yeah, it starts the exploration, but it doesn't end up giving us an answer, and because of that, it's not taking us into the top band. At the denouement of the novella, nice bit of subject terminology there, in chapter 10 all is revealed. Henry Jekyll confesses that he and Hyde were one, and that he enjoyed the liberty and leaping impulses in the disguise of Hyde. The word liberty may refer to the freedom from Victorian hypocrisy that Jekyll felt, as he could release his violent desires without the fear of being judged. So that's another really good idea. But what's Stevenson's view about that? Is that something to be desired, to be able to not be judged by society, or is it something not to be desired, should society be our judge? And because you haven't answered that, you've begun the exploration but not told us where we're going to go. Stevenson highlights the duplicitous nature of humanity through morality and violence as, despite the catharsis felt by Jekyll when he was Hyde, he chose the better part, however, lacked, that should be the strength, to keep to it. Stevenson wants the reader to understand the conflicting struggles that are faced by all of humanity, as we all have impulses to do the wrong thing. Okay, again, you've begun the exploration brilliantly. He wants us to understand the conflict, but what does he want us to understand about it? How should we deal with that conflict? And that would end the exploration. So you see a pattern here, I hope, where you're starting these exploratory ideas but not finishing them off. So if you're not finishing them off, you can't be convincing and you can't have a well-structured argument. So you can see that though you took the examiner to think, well, I'm going to put it in this band possibly at the beginning, your subsequent paragraphs have now ruled this out. So let's come down here. Is it still thoughtful and detailed? Well, it is, but there's a slight anxiety over the developed, because you can see your explanations are not fully developed here. But that's not all the way through the essay. At the beginning, they were fully developed, and you were looking at alternative interpretations and deeper meanings. So the examiner is now pretty confident that you're going to be in this band, and now they're just reading the rest to think, well, what range of marks am I going to give it? Is it at the top of the band, or the bottom, or the middle? It seems that Stevenson justifies Hyde's violence as a natural result of being human. Yet Stevenson shows the deep consequences of submitting to our violent side, as Hyde is forever despised and friendless. The powerful word despised refers to the absolute hatred that Victorians had towards the use of violence, emphasised by the idea of being friendless, as nobody wishes to associate with their own desire for violence. So this half explores Stevenson's point of view. It says that Stevenson justifies Hyde's violence. In other words, what the writer means here is that there is a reason for Hyde's violence, I think, but justifies also means a good enough reason to excuse it. And we haven't really in this essay had an argument that shows that Hyde's violence ought to be excused. That hasn't been proven in the essay. So this again is part of an exploration that isn't fully developed. The essay has shown, however, that there are deep consequences of submitting to our violent side. So that bit has been proved. And it's also proved that the readers would have had an absolute hatred towards violence. So the interpretations in here have been mostly proved, but not fully. Let's look at the conclusion. Stevenson elucidates the egregious consequences that led to suppressing our desires, and perhaps suggested by the justification of Hyde's actions, wants society to gain a more accepting and understanding attitude towards their desire to use violence. So this is a really original idea, that actually he's suggesting that we should put up with a certain level of violence in society, and it's only because Jekyll didn't put up with Hyde's level of violence that he suppressed it, and this made Hyde come out even more violent than he was before. Now, you really needed a quotation to prove that, and the one that would have fitted nicely is, "My devil had been long caged, he came out roaring." This is just before he kills Sir Danvers Carew, and he's talking about having caged Hyde up for a 2-month period. So you needed some evidence to back up that idea, and that one would have fit perfectly. Let's now go back to your thesis and see how many of your ideas you proved. You've definitely proved it's a dangerous and powerful desire that plagues humanity. You've definitely showed it elucidates the dangers of falling into our desires to use violence. You haven't fully proved that Hyde is not inherently evil, because you haven't had that quotation that I just showed you. And you haven't really discussed how Jekyll dies. You don't necessarily have to here in this essay, because it's about Hyde's violence that you're talking about. But that would have been an interesting conclusion. So you've got a choice of keeping that in or actually jettisoning it, because you've already got a discussion of wider violence in society. So this is a student, I should point out, who's watched this video, "Why is the Extract Your Enemy?" So his original essay is in that video and was of a much lower standard because he began with the extract, which is a mistake. Unless you're already a strong grade 7 writer, then you can afford to start with the extract and still have a well-constructed argument. We can see here from the thesis that the argument was very well planned, and we saw at the beginning how it was very well executed. But then as we go through the essay, you started to see the beginnings of explorations, but not full explanations. And so what happens here is the examiner comes back to the idea of best fit. So we've already ruled out being fully convincing exploration. We've definitely seen it as thoughtful, and then it's a question of how developed it is. We'll go down to the level below. Is there a clear understanding? Well, yes, everything in there is totally a clear understanding. It's just not always fully explained. So the best fit, different teachers would argue about. So I'm going to be cautious because there are quite a few paragraphs where ideas weren't fully explained. So we're going to come down more towards the bottom of the mark range, which will be, in some years that will be just into a grade 7, and in others it might be a grade 6 plus. But I'm pretty confident in saying there's enough strength in there for a best fit overall to say we're on into a grade 7. Now there is another thing going on in the examiner's head when they're setting the grade, and that is the level of accuracy of the writing. Now even though that's not in the mark scheme, it is something that controls the examiner's mind because they are English teachers after all, and they're passionate about you getting everything right. So if we go back to the bits of yellow, these are slight inaccuracies either in phrasing or in punctuation, and very occasionally in spelling, but they're mainly about the phrasing and the punctuation. Little things that irritate. And if you just count up the number of yellows, you'll see that there is a powerful irritation for the examiner. And so if you're interested, I've copied and pasted the original essay below, which you can read through and learn from the changes that I've made. I haven't gone through all of those because it makes the video too long for your revision. But anyway, you can mute my voice, get rid of my sound, and have a look at the changes, or see if you can spot them yourself. What corrections would you make? That would be a brilliant way for you to see if you've fully understood whether you're accurate or not. There's a bit more, and there's the end. So I hope you found that really useful. See you soon on my channel.